Have you ever felt trapped in something that everyone called a blessing, but inside was slowly destroying you? Have you ever looked at the altar and wondered if that yes you gave, surrounded by prayers and praise, was truly God's plan, or just a choice you made that now costs you dearly? I'm Linda Thompson, 57 years old, a mother, a Christian, and for a long time, I was a silent woman, suffocated inside a marriage that seemed perfect to the church, but that stole my soul every day. When they looked at me, they saw the smiling wife, present at services, firm in her faith, an obedient servant. But what no one saw, or perhaps chose not to see, was the pain I hid, the betrayal, the emotional abandonment, the constant judgment, the silencing within my own faith. Do you recognize yourself in this experience? That kind of relationship where God's name is used as a chain, not as a liberation? I came to believe that my suffering was spiritual, that my role as a Christian woman was to endure, pray more, be more silent, be strong. But does God really call us to survive in silence within a relationship that distances us from Him, from ourselves, and from the abundant life He promised? This video isn't just about pain, it's about truth, about a God who doesn't remain silent in the face of injustice, even when that injustice wears a suit and carries a Bible. It's about the day I realized what kept me married wasn't faith, it was fear, and that's when something began to change. Trust me, the ending is worth it, but before you get there, you need to know how it all began, because the next thing could change your perspective, and maybe even your life. I met my ex-husband inside the church, in one of those gatherings we believe to be a direct answer to prayer. He was a worship leader, beloved by all, eloquent with his words, always surrounded by people, and he seemed to carry a light that drew attention. You know the kind of man who, when he enters the church, people whisper, "That's a man of God?" Well, I thought so too, and it was precisely this image that made me lower my guard. Deep down, something told me I was moving too fast, but everything around me seemed to confirm that it was God's will. Friends approved, the leadership encouraged, and everything was enveloped in an almost prophetic atmosphere. It was as if my story was fitting into the perfect narrative I'd always dreamed of. The beginning was full of promises, promises of care, of partnership in ministry, of a family structured on the principles of faith. I barely realized that while I was playing the role of a model couple in the eyes of others, there were already subtle, but dangerous, signs of control, emotional manipulation, and a certain kind of spiritual pride disguised as zeal. But when we're too involved, we mistake warning signs for proof of commitment. And that's how I found myself immersed in a relationship where appearances mattered more than truth, where spiritual performance hid hidden secrets that no one dared question. The worst part? I didn't want to see it myself, because admitting that that dream could be an illusion built on expectations and religious pressure hurt more than enduring the daily discomfort. And that's where something almost no one talks about comes in. The fear of disappointing others can be more paralyzing than the fear of living unhappily. So I molded myself, silently, trying to believe it was just a phase, that with more prayer, fasting, and patience, everything would fall into place. But while I maintained this facade, something inside me began to die. And that's exactly where true transformation begins, when the pain of continuing overcomes the fear of change. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. The wedding was beautiful. A packed church, white flowers, a long veil, and a soundtrack that brought tears to the eyes of those in attendance. The blessing was given with powerful words, the kind that make us believe we are, in fact, sealing a heavenly union. The pastor spoke about covenant, purpose, and mission as a couple. I felt chosen, honored, almost as if I were being promoted to a new spiritual level. The rings were consecrated before the altar, and the vows of eternal love came from his lips with such conviction that in that moment I surrendered myself completely, body, soul, heart, and expectation. In my mind, it all made sense. It was God's perfect plan, a man who served in worship, a woman steadfast in her faith, and a home that, in the eyes of others, began with the right ingredients. I saw no room for doubt. The logic was clear. If God brought people together, He will bless them. But what almost no one talks about is that not every union that occurs within the church is led by the Spirit. And it took me many years to understand this hidden truth. The excessive spiritualization of the relationship prevented me from questioning the signs. After all, how could I doubt something that had begun with prayer, pastoral approval, and promises of eternity? In the first few months, he was still attentive. There was affection, there was that enthusiasm of the beginning of a journey, but it was all more appearance than real development. Prayers at home were rare, spiritual conversations almost non-existent. Admiration was quickly replaced by subtle criticism, dry gestures, and behavior that outsiders would never have guessed. But I clung to the memories of the altar. I told myself, it's just a phase. The beginning is always difficult. He's tired. It's the pressure of ministry. But the emotional impact began to take its toll. My laughter became more restrained. My spontaneity diminished. And without realizing it, I became someone who lived for the sake of maintaining a peaceful atmosphere in the house, even when it cost me my own peace. This shift in mindset is silent but devastating. When you start to measure your words, your clothing, even your way of praying, so as not to create discomfort, it's a sign that something is seriously off. But I was still stuck in the idea that enduring was synonymous with being strong in faith. So I kept trying to save a dream that might never have been real. And it was in this blind effort to preserve what seemed spiritual that the first internal ruptures began to happen. In the beginning, everything could still be camouflaged with rehearsed smiles and spiritual justifications. But it was still in the first year of marriage that the first cracks occurred. It wasn't with an open betrayal, nor a violent argument. It was with silence. A different, heavy silence. One that didn't come from peace, but from coldness. The screams came, yes, but not the kind that scares you in the moment. They were harsh words spoken aloud, in small moments, followed by a look that nullified. And I, with that mindset shaped to endure and not question, began to swallow everything with prayer. I told myself it was a phase, that the stress of routine, the challenges of ministry, or even the enemy were creating breaches. But deep down, something was already crying out for help. The small betrayals of trust came as discreet cracks, things I discovered that he always had a spiritually packaged explanation to justify, contacts that made no sense, prolonged absences disguised as important meetings, a cell phone he hid under his pillow. And still, I said nothing. I kept quiet, because within the church, I had already understood that a wise woman is one who keeps quiet, prays, and waits. And that's how I began to confuse faith with passivity. I began to accept less than I deserved, believing it was spiritual maturity. The truth is, I didn't want to be seen as the problematic wife, the one who creates conflict, the one who doesn't support the home with prayer. This silent belief was eating away at me from within. I began to lose my spark, my spontaneity, my sense of worth, and most dangerously, I began to doubt my own perception. I sensed something was wrong, but I convinced myself it was paranoia. This kind of emotional self-sabotage is subtle, but it has a profound impact on how we see ourselves. I began to diminish my presence, my voice, my identity. It was as if I were trying to fit into a mold that was increasingly suffocating me. Outsiders praised our blessed couple, and that trapped me even more, because leaving would mean admitting it was all a mistake. And how could I explain this? How? Could I justify to the church, to my family, to myself, that the dream I so zealously defended was slowly turning into an emotional and spiritual prison? And the more I tried to adjust, the more he distanced himself. Our prayers together ceased. Conversations became cold and mechanical. And in the moments I sought closeness, what came was contempt, or even worse, indifference. An indifference that hurts more than any argument. I still believed everything could change, that if I prayed more, fasted more, loved more, things would go back to the way they were. But the beginning was already an illusion, and it was at this point in the journey that I began, for the first time, to suspect that perhaps I was fighting alone for something that existed only within me. On the outside, the image was impeccable. The devoted wife, always present at services, participating in events, smiling in the hallways, and praising her husband publicly. I knew exactly what was expected of me, and I became an expert at delivering it. No one suspected the chaos behind our front door. The prison I lived in had no bars, no visible locks. It was an emotional prison, slowly built with the cement of guilt, the fear of disappointment, the weight of a commitment that, in the eyes of others, was too sacred to touch. The truth is, I was dying inside, and the cruelest thing was realizing that no one saw it. Or, perhaps, they didn't want to see it. The feeling of invisibility within one's own pain is one of the loneliest there is. I walked among my brothers like a well-made-up ghost, and when, rarely, someone noticed my duller look, the response came like a spiritual slap. You need to pray more, sister. This struggle is meant to strengthen you. Every marriage goes through phases. None of these phrases could reach what I truly felt. I didn't need canned advice. I needed to be heard, welcomed, seen as a real person, not as a role I was supposed to play. And this gradually undermined my sense of identity. I no longer knew where the real woman ended and the persona I played every Sunday began. My laughter was measured, my words calculated. I avoided any exposure that might generate comment or suspicion. I lived on an emotional tightrope between maintaining an image and hiding my pain. And with each passing day, I felt the woman I'd been before that marriage, the one who dreamed big, who made plans, who laughed lightly, was fading like a candle in a closed room. The most contradictory thing is that I felt abandoned in the very place where I should have found refuge, the church. What was supposed to be a hospital for souls, for me, became a stage where I had to perform. No one noticed the emotional exhaustion, the teary eyes after services, the mechanical smiles I used as a shield. It was as if I were screaming inside, and yet the audience applauded my performance. And the silence, that was the loudest sound in my soul. But the body speaks what the mouth cannot. I began to experience anxiety attacks, unexplained physical pain, and a constant fatigue that wouldn't go away even with rest. The impact of that life of deception began to manifest itself in every possible way. And yet, I told myself I needed to be strong. Because after all, isn't that what a woman of faith should be? This pattern of self-sacrifice disguised as obedience was so ingrained in me that even when everything hurt, I felt guilty for even considering leaving. It was as if I believed that leaving that marriage was abandoning God, and this confusion between faith and prison was one of the hardest chains to break. Because before leaving that house, I had to break out of a mindset that made me believe that suffering in silence was part of the mission. And that took time. Breaking out of that mindset was, in fact, the first miracle, because it doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow, intimate process, full of doubts and small awakenings. I remember one night, alone in the living room, looking at a photo of us on the wall, the image of a blessed couple, well-positioned, admired, but I knew what lay behind that portrait. And for the first time, out loud, I whispered, "This isn't life." It wasn't a pretty prayer, nor a courageous declaration. It was almost a whisper from someone who no longer had the strength to scream. But it was true. And that small act of facing the truth was already the beginning of an invisible liberation. If you're listening to all this and somehow recognize yourself, know that you're not alone. There are many women living silently behind the scenes, with pain disguised as faith, trying to maintain a structure that no longer supports them. And that's precisely why I decided to tell my story this way, in every detail. Because we need to talk about what almost no one talks about. And if this kind of content touches your heart, if you feel it resonates, if it embraces you in some way, subscribe to the channel, not just to follow, but to walk alongside. Your presence here makes a difference, truly. It's what makes this message reach other women who, right now, may be experiencing exactly what I experienced. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. Real, profound, and necessary. If anything I've said so far has touched you, leave a comment. Sometimes, what you share might be the answer another woman needs to read. This isn't just a video, it's a safe space to start over. And it was precisely when I stopped trying to maintain an image and started facing the signs honestly that my true journey of transformation began to take shape. A wise woman builds her home. I heard this phrase like a mantra. No matter how much I was suffering, no matter the loneliness, no matter the screams, no matter the looks of contempt, whenever I considered sharing my pain with someone, she came, cold, cutting, and coated in spiritual pity. Be wise, build, submit. It was as if my faith had been transformed into a cell where I locked the door myself, thinking I was pleasing God. And the worst part is that, after hearing this repetition so often, I began to believe the problem was me, that wanting to escape pain was selfish, a lack of faith, a lack of patience, perhaps even rebellion. God hates divorce. How often has this been used as a weapon, not as guidance? I'm not saying marriage isn't sacred. I still believe that with all my heart. But what I've slowly begun to realize is that the God who hates divorce also hates injustice, abuse disguised as authority, pain masked by religiosity. And this has been one of the greatest revelations of my journey, understanding that God is not pleased with a home where women slowly die in the name of distorted submission. The hidden truth behind many spiritual phrases is that they have often been used to silence, not to liberate. And this has a profound impact, not only emotionally, but also on the spirituality of those who live this reality. I remember one particular Sunday. We had just left the service, where he had led praise with passion and tears. People were moved, some were crying. In the car on the way home, the silence was already heavy. As we parked, he turned to me and said, without even looking at me, "You're not going to ruin my day today with your drama, understand?" And it was like being stabbed in the chest. There was no argument. There was no apparent reason. It was just the way he treated me, with disdain, with harshness. And afterward, when someone asked how we were, he would say with a smile, "Thank God, married and strengthened in the Lord." And I smiled back, because that was what they expected of me, because the theater of spirituality demanded my blind obedience, because somehow I had been taught that enduring this kind of emotional violence was proof of fidelity to God. But true faith doesn't imprison. Faith heals. Faith reveals. Faith lifts us from the ground. And it took me a long time, and a lot of crying, to separate what was God's voice from what was fear. There's a very fine line between submission and oblivion, and often it's crossed without us even realizing it. When we start to feel like we need to apologize for being sad, that we need to hide bruises on our soul with verses taken out of context, that we need to smile when everything inside us wants to scream, it's a sign that something is deeply distorted. At this point, my mindset was completely trapped. I felt guilty about everything, for thinking about leaving, for wanting help, for not being happy, for not being able to feel anything when he touched me. And that's exactly what makes this kind of prison so cruel. It doesn't have iron bars, but it does have walls of guilt. And guilt, when fed with pretty phrases, becomes a chain that's difficult to break. It was at this point in my journey that I began asking questions I hadn't dared ask before. Dangerous questions, perhaps, but necessary. Like, did God put me in that marriage? Or was it me who put myself in it, trying to fit everything into a box that seemed spiritual but was merely convenient? These questions, little by little, began to open cracks in the darkness, and each crack brought a little light. Enough light for me to see what had previously been hidden. Light that confronted me, yes, but also prepared me for decisions I never imagined I had the courage to make. There were 3 betrayals. 3, each one with a different weight, but all leaving a kind of scar you can't see in the mirror. The first I discovered by accident, during an untimely call, a muffled, embarrassed female voice on the other end. He denied it, saying it was a church member asking for prayer. I wanted to believe him. The second came months later, this time with clearer evidence, cell phone conversations, messages saved in hidden folders. He deleted some but forgot others. I confronted him, and he accused me of being invasive, controlling, neurotic. It was always like that. When I brought the truth to light, I became the problem. But it was the third one that truly paralyzed me, the cruelest, the most absurd, the one that made me question whether I was still in touch with reality or living in some kind of delusion. She was part of our cell group. She was at our meetings, our prayer services at home. She sat at the table with me, prayed for our lives, and then sent him photos. It was like living a nightmare with a worship soundtrack. I discovered it all one morning. Something deeply bothered me. A discomfort I can only describe as a spiritual wake-up call. I grabbed his phone while he slept. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I found it. The messages were there. Details, intimacies, declarations. And there was no denying it anymore. The world stopped that day. I didn't cry. Not right away. I remained silent for hours, as if my brain was trying to process something too big to contain. I felt a mixture of nausea, shame, and pent-up fury. The betrayal itself was painful, but the context, that was what tore me apart. It went beyond the bounds of marital infidelity. It was a spiritual, emotional, human violation. Someone I welcomed into my home, who said amen with me, and who, in the shadows, participated in my destruction. There, in that moment, something inside me died. It wasn't just love. It was the trust in what I believed was sacred. It was the idea that faith was enough to protect. And what frightened me most was his reaction. No genuine regret, no pain in his eyes, only excuses. You pushed me away. I was needy. She understood me, as if it were my fault, as if I had provoked him. And this manipulation was the final straw that broke the camel's back. Because, for the first time, I saw everything without the filter of religion, without the fear of disappointing the church, without the veneer of spirituality. I saw the man who stood there, stripped of the image of servant, leader, husband. I saw someone cold, self-centered, empty. And in that moment, amidst the ashes of what I had once dreamed of, a decision was born, not complete, unresolved, but real. A seed of rupture, of truth, of liberation. From that point on, my journey would no longer be about maintaining a marriage. It would start being about reclaiming myself. But do you know what hurt most about all of this? It wasn't the betrayal. As heartbreaking as it was, as much as it left me in pieces I could still understand, not accept, but understand, that human beings make mistakes, that there are destructive choices. What really hurt me, what struck me in a way I didn't even know was possible, was the judgment. The stern look from someone who once called me a woman of faith, the uncomfortable silence of people who once embraced me in the church hallways, the whispers behind the scenes, the whispers disguised as concern, the lack of support when I needed it most. Suddenly, I went. From being the hard-working wife to the rebel, the insubmissive, the example gone wrong. All because I decided not to die silently in a marriage that no longer existed in essence. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't make a fuss. But all it took was for me to walk away. All it took was for me to show a crack in that perfect image, for many to turn their backs. And ironically, it was at that moment that I understood what it means to be judged more for the courage to break a lie than for sticking with it. The hidden truth no one wants to admit is that in many places, it's more acceptable to be unhappy than to be honest. Keeping up appearances is a valuable currency. Breaking them comes at a high cost. The questions began to come, always with that tone of false empathy. But have you tried everything? Did you really pray? Are you sure you're not acting in the flesh? It was as if my suffering was only valid if it was silent, demure, and carried with a smile on my face. The impact on my spirituality was profound. I felt unworthy, alienated, almost as if there was no longer room for me in the environment that had once been my refuge. And inside, a painful conflict. How can the same community that taught me about grace, mercy, and unconditional love now treat me as if I were a walking spiritual failure? It was at this point in my journey that I realized how institutionalized faith can become a minefield for those who choose to live truthfully. Not because God is like that, He isn't, but because many confuse obedience to rules with fidelity to the Spirit. And I understood that if I wanted to survive emotionally and spiritually, I would need to separate God from the structure. I would need to learn to hear His voice, even when it contradicted the collective chorus. And this required a complete rebuilding of my mindset. I had to relearn what it means to have faith. Because faith, I discovered, isn't about silently accepting everything. Faith, sometimes, is breaking free from what destroys and trusting that God remains present even when the ground disappears. This was one of the loneliest decisions of my life. But paradoxically, it was also the beginning of my reunion with God. Because it was outside the system, outside the approval of others, outside the norms of good behavior, that I once again heard that gentle voice saying, "I am still here. I never left you." And when that voice spoke louder than all the others, I knew something was changing within me. It wasn't just a new beginning. It was the birth of a new consciousness. I was silenced, not with direct words, but with averted glances, with invitations that stopped coming, with conversations that changed course when I approached. Suddenly, I realized I was no longer welcome in the same spaces where I had once been embraced. I was removed from ministries without clear justification, without an honest conversation, without even a look of compassion. It was as if my pain had become too uncomfortable to bear witness to. And it wasn't long before isolation became routine. People greeted me with smiles, not smiles. And I, who had served with dedication for so many years, began to wonder if they had ever truly seen me. I cried. I cried a lot. But not in public, not at the altar, not in the hallways where presence was supposed to heal. I cried in the church bathroom, locked in one of the stalls, my hand over my mouth, trying to contain the sound of my sobs so no one could hear. It was there, in that hidden space, that I allowed myself to feel. It wasn't just sadness. It was a mixture of humiliation, confusion, and a kind of loneliness that echoes even in the midst of a crowd. And the most distressing thing was knowing that, even surrounded by people who claimed to love God, I felt invisible. Silence, when it's not a choice, becomes a scream. A muffled scream, but one that hurts inside. And in that moment, that's exactly what my life became. A suppressed scream. I wanted to call for help. I wanted to say, "It's not okay." But there was an invisible barrier holding me back. Maybe it was the fear of being judged again. Or maybe it was that distorted belief that Christian women need to hold firm without causing a scene, without exposing their wounds. All the while, I struggled with the feeling of being wrong for feeling pain, as if my vulnerability were proof of weakness, as if my desire to leave was a lack of faith. But that silence took me to a place no one saw, an emotional abyss where I could no longer pray as I once had, where the Bible felt heavy in my hands, where God's presence seemed distant, not because He had left me, but because I could no longer draw near. It's difficult to explain how the soul withdraws when it finds no shelter even in what was once its safe haven. I was in church, but I could no longer dwell in faith. Spirituality became a garment I wore out of habit, but which no longer warmed me. And yet, no matter how deep that well was, something inside me wouldn't completely extinguish. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but there was a spark, a remnant of hope mixed with indignation, because deep down, I knew that kind of silence didn't come from God, that the God I knew as a child, who visited me in the early hours of the morning, who welcomed me in secret, would never place me in a place to be nullified. So I began to ask questions that hurt. I began to look at myself more honestly. I began to recognize that what was suffocating me wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the absence of truth around me. And understanding this was the beginning of a new kind of courage. A courage born not of strength, but of accumulated pain that finally finds voice. When courage began to take shape within me, it didn't come with grand declarations or drastic changes. It came with small but profound gestures. I began to allow myself to exist outside of that bubble where everything had to seem perfect. Allowed myself to admit that I wasn't okay, that being strong all the time was costing me dearly. And it was there, in that space of truth, that the reconstruction began, without spiritual makeup, without performance, just me and God, raw, real, broken, but alive. And with this courage slowly emerging, I understood something that perhaps you too need to hear. It's not selfish to seek healing. It's not rebellion to leave a place that makes you sick. And it's not a lack of faith to decide that it's time to breathe again. If you feel this conversation resonates with you, if it somehow resonates with your story, or reminds you of someone, like this video, because every like shows that this message needs to continue being shared. It needs to reach other women who, perhaps at this very moment, are silently experiencing the same pain I once experienced. Your interaction here isn't just a click. It's like a silent, "I understand you," helping to build a safe space for those who can no longer pretend. And that has immense value. It was in this silent awakening, in this reconnection with myself, that I began to realize that what I feared most, rejection, judgment, loneliness, no longer held the same weight, because something inside me was rising again, not quickly or magically, but steadily. And it was then that the pain began to transform into direction. There was one night in particular that still lives in my memory as a breaking point. It was one of those nights when the silence seems to scream louder than any sound. My children were already asleep. The house was dark, and I sat on the kitchen floor because I couldn't even make it to the bedroom. My soul was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body, the kind that weighs on the shoulders, but is born in the spirit. I felt short of breath, my chest tightening, and with my head between my legs, I let out everything I'd held in for years. The tears came like an avalanche, and there, in the middle of the night, with my face wet and my hands shaking, I spoke to God in a way I never had before. It wasn't a formal prayer. It had no verses. It had no embellishment. It was a naked outburst, raw, a stifled plea. Lord, take me. I can't take it anymore. Those words hurt me more than any betrayal I'd ever experienced, because it wasn't a death wish. It was a plea for escape. I just wanted to escape myself, from the pain, from history, from repetition. I wanted to disappear without drama, without explanation, just disappear. And it was in that final place that a light, however small, lit up inside me. A thought almost whispered, but firm. Either I died there, not physically, but emotionally, or I let God make something new with what was left of me. That night, I understood that rebuilding doesn't begin when the pain subsides. It begins when we stop denying that it's hurting. Because only when I allowed myself to touch the bottom of my inner abyss did I realize it wasn't the end. It was the ground. And the ground can be the very place where God begins to build something completely different. I didn't rise from that kitchen with a plan in hand, but I rose with a silent decision. I no longer wanted to survive. I wanted to live, for real. And that decision forced me to face many hidden truths that I had been sweeping under the spiritual rug. I began to observe more clearly the underpinnings of my own decisions. I realized that much of what I called faith was actually fear dressed up as doctrine. I hid behind religiosity because it seemed safer than facing chaos. And this wasn't just about marriage. It was about everything. About how I dealt with my feelings, about how I ceased to exist to fit into others' ideals of me, about how I feared disappointing even the image I had built for myself. The impact of this was devastating, because while I fed the mask, my essence withered. It was a hard journey to understand that I could change, that it was allowed, that God wasn't calling me to be a martyr to a failed relationship, but a free daughter on a journey of transformation. That night, I began to renounce not the marriage itself, but the idea that I needed to continue denying who I was to keep up appearances. And there, with no one around, no ready advice, no emotional promises, I said quietly, "If you still see me here, help me start over." I didn't expect an immediate answer. I didn't hear a voice from heaven, but there was a different silence, a silence full of presence, a silence that didn't condemn, that didn't demand performance, a silence that said, "I heard you." And that was the first step. From then on, everything that followed would no longer be an attempt to return to what was, but rather a journey towards something completely new. Because when we finally allow ourselves to break, without feeling guilty, the space of pain becomes fertile ground for healing. And that's what began to happen to me, little by little, unhurriedly, but steadily. And that's how that night, which seemed like the end, became the beginning of my liberation. That early morning, with my soul still bleeding and my body heavy as if carrying years of accumulated fatigue, I prayed the most sincere prayer of my life. It wasn't rehearsed. It didn't follow any pattern. It didn't have a pretty beginning or a tidy ending. I just knelt there, just as I was, my eyes still swollen and my heart completely exposed, and said, "Father, if this isn't your plan for me, take me out of here, even if it hurts, even if I don't understand, even if I have to leave everything behind." It was the first time in many years that I didn't pray to save my marriage. I didn't ask for change. I didn't plead for more patience or wisdom. I didn't plead for restoration. I asked for deliverance. At that moment, I realized how much I had been praying, not for God's will, but for the preservation of something I feared losing, because we cling to what we know, even when it destroys us. And I had to admit it bluntly before God, that my insistence on that relationship was no longer love, it was fear. Fear of being rejected by the church, fear of scandal, fear of starting over, fear of disappointing my children, fear of living alone, fear of looking in the mirror and no longer knowing who I was outside of that structure. But when I said those words, even with a crack in my voice, it was as if a weight began to lift from my shoulders. That prayer didn't immediately change everything on the outside. He remained the same. The routine was still cold. The look still carried guilt and contempt. But something inside me had been moved. It was almost imperceptible, but real. It was as if, for the first time, I had unlocked an inner door that had been sealed for years. And when we open that door, even just a little, it's as if the heavens bend down just to hear what we dare to say for the first time. I spent hours on that floor, sometimes in silence, sometimes just repeating softly, "I trust in the Lord, even if it hurts." And it was in that space of total surrender that I began to understand what surrender truly means. It's not passivity. It's not accepting everything in the name of blind faith. It's placing before God what you can no longer bear and allowing Him to intervene, even when that intervention comes in the form of rupture. From that night on, I stopped asking for signs and began paying attention to those who were already there all the time. I just didn't want to see. The revelations began to surface in the form of memories, small episodes I had normalized, cruel words spoken in jest, derogatory comments about my appearance, my worth, my faith, situations where I diminished myself just to maintain the peace. And all of this began to paint a clearer picture of what I was really experiencing. It wasn't just a difficult marriage. It was an abusive reality sustained by a religious structure that taught me to endure it as if it were virtue. This new mindset brought me intense internal conflicts. I still felt guilty. I still woke up in the middle of the night, afraid of making a mistake, of disobeying, of rebelling against what God has joined together. But now, along with the guilt, a courage I hadn't recognized began to grow, a courage that came from the truth. And the truth, no matter how hard, always brings freedom. That process was painful, yes. There were tears, doubts, relapses, days when I almost backed out. But at the same time, each step I took sincerely before God strengthened my weary legs. This phase of my journey was marked by a decision that seemed simple, but was revolutionary: choosing the truth. Not the truth others wanted to hear, not the convenient truth, but the truth of my soul, of my story, of what I knew God saw, even when no one else did. And this truth began to guide me, even in the midst of chaos. It was this truth that made me get up from prayer and, for the first time in years, look around and ask, if God truly wants abundant life for me, where is it? And once that question echoed within me, it never left. Because there, that early morning, kneeling on the floor of a dark room, I received no audible answer. I saw no vision, heard no prophecy, felt no wind blow, but I received something more precious, the peace of someone who has finally chosen to stop insisting on something God was no longer supporting. And it was with this peace, however, timid, however fragile, that I arose. And when I arose, I realized that even though everything around me remained the same, I was no longer the same. It was after that prayer that everything began to change, and not in the way I imagined. I didn't wake up the next day with clear answers or a completely healed heart, but there was something different in the air, a kind of gentle lucidity, as if the scales were slowly falling from my eyes. God didn't speak to me with an audible voice, and I longer expected that. In fact, I had already understood that when He wants to guide us, He speaks through movements, not just with words, but with doors. Some close so abruptly that we are startled, others open so silently that they almost go unnoticed, but they all carry purpose. And I began to see these signs, like someone finally learning to read between the lines. One of the first doors to close was within myself. the door of tolerance disguised as faith. The strength I once used to endure in silence now bothered me. I began to lose the ability to pretend. What I once did out of habit, like attending meetings with a serene face while my heart bled, now made me nauseous. It was as if the Holy Spirit was realigning my internal compass. Situations I had previously accepted now generated a new kind of indignation. Not angry, but enlightening. Truth has that effect. It stirs what's out of place. It shakes. Shortly after, other doors opened. Some more symbolic, others very practical. People began to leave naturally, without arguments, without conflict. They simply left the scene. It was as if the stage was being cleared, reorganized. Invitations I'd previously received disappeared, and strangely, that brought me relief, because I no longer needed to perform. I no longer needed to smile to fit in. The door to ministry, for example, which I'd previously considered the heart of my identity, closed silently, and I accepted it. For the first time, I realized that God's value to me wasn't conditioned by my position. At the same time, other doors began to open. Discreet, silent doors. A distant friend who reappeared with precise words. An unexpected invitation to a women's retreat where for the first time in a long time, I could be without a mask. A forgotten devotional that fell from the middle of a book and reminded me of ancient promises. It wasn't a coincidence. It was God showing me that I wasn't alone in rebuilding. And the more I allowed Him to lead me, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Not in the time I wanted, but in the time needed. One of the biggest revelations of this stage was understanding that escape routes can also hurt. Escaping isn't always about running. Sometimes it's about standing when everything inside you wants to hide. It's about choosing to leave the mental prison before physically leaving the situation. And I experienced this. Before even making any practical decisions, I needed to internally disconnect from the idea that my life only made sense within that marriage. It was a process of mental liberation. And this kind of transformation happens in the invisible, but changes everything in the visible. At this point in my journey, I began to see pain as part of the healing process, not as punishment. The mindset that once had me asking, "What did I do wrong?" began to transform into a deeper question. What does God want to teach me through this? And this simple shift in perspective had a huge impact, because it stopped being about the other person and became about what He was building within me. The journey was no longer about saving a marriage, but about saving my soul, about rescuing the woman I'd lost back then, when I'd begun to deny myself to maintain a crumbling structure. And it was in this scenario of doors closing and opening that I realized God didn't want me tied to something just because it began with prayer. Not every door He opens comes with a satin bow. Some come with tears, with fear, with doubts. But all of them, bring liberation. And the further I continued, the more I realized it wasn't about returning to who I was before, but about becoming who I had never been able to be, a whole woman, free, at peace with God and with herself. It was in this environment of silent faith and inner transformation that I understood. He wasn't just taking me from one place. He was leading me to a new life. Leaving wasn't simple. It wasn't like a movie where the protagonist packs her life into 2 suitcases and heads off with the wind in her face and a new destination in mind. Leaving, for me, was a decision made in layers, overcoming one fear at a time. I didn't have a detailed plan, no saved resources, no solid support network. All I had was a conviction within myself, born in that early morning prayer, that staying where I was would be a setback for everything God had already begun to restore in me. I knew moving on would hurt, but in that moment, staying hurt more. I left, with 2 teenage children who, even without understanding everything, could already sense that the house was not peaceful. I left penniless, with bills piling up, and a heart still mended. I didn't have a fresh start party, nor a pat on the back. I met with silence, veiled judgments, and, from some, even an attempt at guilt disguised as concern. But God, who had already been guiding me through unexpected doors, continued to do what only He knows how to do: create paths where human eyes only see. Walls. The first few days were cruel. I'd wake up scared, afraid I was doing everything wrong. Insecurity tried to pull me back with familiar phrases. You'll regret it. You'll be in need. You destroyed your family. But there was something different in me, a subtle strength, fueled by every small decision not to go back. I called this strength practical faith because it was no longer a pretty sentiment preached on Sundays. It was incarnate faith, the faith that signs leases with a heavy heart, that goes to the grocery store with counted coins, that comforts children when they ask, "What now, Mom?" even without knowing the answer. My routine became a silent battleground. Every day was a choice. Either I gave in to despair or I took another step toward rebuilding. I discovered that faith often feels like routine, getting up, cooking, looking for work, crying in secret, but still carrying on. There was no glamour, there was determination, and in the midst of it all, God used small details to remind me that I wasn't alone. A phone call at the right time, a grocery purchase left on my doorstep by someone who preferred to remain anonymous, a verse read by chance that seemed to have been written for me. These small signs became big in the context in which I lived. They were proof that He was watching over me behind the scenes. I also began to discover things about myself that I hadn't even realized existed. The woman who once dreamed big, who loved to write, to teach, to laugh without guilt was there, alive, just dormant. And with each step outside that oppressive structure, she was awakening. I rediscovered my voice, not the voice that pleases everyone, but the one that carries truth. I began to use that voice even though I was trembling. I began talking to other women who also lived in similar prisons, and without realizing it, God was giving me a new purpose in the midst of the chaos. The pain that had silenced me began to transform into connection. Shame gave way to compassion, and this completely changed the way I saw everything. Of course, there were dark days. There were times when I wanted to backtrack just to avoid the hassle of explaining my decision. There were accusatory looks, invasive questions, comments disguised as prayer. But the more I walked, the stronger my mindset became. I discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's carrying on even with it pounding in your chest. And each day I survived outside of that place, I understood a little more the magnitude of the deliverance God gave me. Because He didn't just rescue me from a marriage. He rescued me from a cycle of emotional and spiritual destruction that was slowly killing me. I had to leave without all the answers, without knowing how I would support my children, without knowing what would come next. But I left with faith, a real faith, honed in pain, sustained by decisions. And this faith taught me that God doesn't always lead us out of the desert. Sometimes He walks with us through it. And it was this constant, silent presence that kept me going on days when everything around me told me I couldn't handle it. And that's precisely why I say with all conviction, when God takes us from a place, it's not because He wants to punish us. It's because He's preserving us. He's preparing us. He's calling us to a new chapter that, however challenging it may seem, will bring life where before there was only survival. This transition, though, full of uncertainty, marked the beginning of my true journey. And it was on this path, marked by difficult decisions and persistent faith, that I began to understand that the freedom God gives isn't just external. It begins within. And once you experience this, you can no longer live pretending you don't know what it means to truly live. The new beginning didn't come with inspiring background music or happy endings wrapped in promises. It came real, raw, and intense. It came step by step, tear by tear. The kind of new beginning you don't post on social media, that you don't celebrate with parties, but that completely changes the very fabric of who you are inside. At first, I thought leaving that marriage was the end of the pain, but I quickly understood that it was just the beginning of another phase, relearning to live without the weight I'd carried for so many years. I had to face the echo of emptiness inside my home, the silence of my children trying to understand what was happening. The refrigerator with more space than food, the bills piling up and the constant doubt about tomorrow. There was humiliation, yes. There were moments when I swallowed my pride to accept help. Situations where people who barely knew me were more generous than those I'd lived with for decades. The scarcity wasn't just financial, it was emotional, spiritual, social. I was no longer so-and-so's sister, the wife of someone important. Now I was just me. And this, though frightening at first, was the foundation for building my identity outside of others' image. But what surprised me was realizing that even on the darkest days, God didn't leave me without direction. He used details, and how He is a master of details. An anonymously donated grocery store when the cupboard was nearly empty. An unexpected message with a precise word at the exact moment I was about to give up. A hug from someone who didn't know everything, but who enveloped me as if they did. His presence came through in these gestures, in those subtexts. It was never about the magnitude of the miracle, but about the timing, always at the exact moment, neither before nor after. I learned to celebrate small victories, a payment made on the day, a smile from my children after difficult days, a simple lunch prepared with what I had, but with gratitude. I discovered that rebuilding a life is like putting together a puzzle with pieces you don't even know where they are, and every right decision, no matter how small, is a piece that fits together. There were days when I cried alone, afraid I'd never dream again. But it was on those days that God reminded me, starting over isn't about going back to square one, it's about choosing a new path with everything you've learned. My mindset needed a complete overhaul. I was no longer the woman who accepted emotional crumbs. I was no longer the one who kept quiet to please. I had discovered my own voice, and now it no longer fit in places of forced silence. This process was slow. I had to deal with the shame, the insecurity, the guilt that still insisted on surfacing. But God was teaching me something valuable. Healing comes as we walk. You don't wait until you're strong to move on. Strength comes as you move. And even stumbling, I kept going. Even tired, I kept going. Because I knew I was no longer alone. Not really. One of the most profound revelations I had during this period was realizing how true faith is sustained behind the scenes. When no one is watching, when there is no applause, when there is no ready-made testimony to share. It was in these behind-the-scenes moments that transformation happened. In the silence of the early morning, in the prayers whispered with tears, in the difficult decisions I made even without guarantees. And it was in these behind-the-scenes moments that God began to show me what it means to live fully, even when everything around me seems fragile. I also came to understand that freedom is not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. I still faced difficulties, but now there was purpose in every step. Each challenge taught me something. Each locked door revealed another that would soon open. And little by little, what had once been just survival gave way to a more authentic life. I began to look in the mirror with more compassion. I began to see myself as God saw me, not as a broken woman, but as someone being shaped with purpose, and that completely changed the weight of my days. During Waya, this new beginning, there were countless voices trying to remind me of what I had lost. But with each attempt to paralyze me, God showed me everything I was gaining. Dignity, peace, freedom, clarity. I no longer sought to go back. Now I sought to move forward with determination. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. All I needed was to remain faithful to the journey He had begun in me. And the further I walked, the more I understood. What seemed like the end was, in fact, the fertile sea. Ground where God was planting a new version of my story. And it was still just beginning. Today, I am a free woman. And I'm not talking about a freedom dependent on external circumstances or the validation of others. It's a freedom built from within, brick by brick, as God restored areas of my soul that were buried under years of silence, fear, and false submission. I am free because I learned to no longer accept a distorted version of myself. Free because I no longer need to carry guilt that doesn't belong to me. Free because I understood that God's grace doesn't bind me to the past. It pushes me forward, propels me to live the life He dreamed for me from the beginning. I am healed, but not because I've forgotten what I experienced. On the contrary, I remember everything. But now, when I remember, it no longer bleeds. The pain has become memory, and memory, testimony. I'm not talking about a healing that made me invincible, but a healing that made me whole. Whole, even with scars. Whole, even with memories that still touch me deeply. The difference is that today, these scars don't paralyze me. They position me. They are part of the journey that shaped me. And it was in this process that God made me blossom again. Not in the same way. I didn't return to who I was. I became who I never thought I would be. Today, I recognize myself as someone empowered in the Lord. And it's curious to think about this, because for many years, the word empowerment seemed almost a sin within certain religious discourses, as if being a woman of God meant being erased, weak, submissive in the most distorted sense possible. But God showed me that empowerment, when it comes from Him, is pure transformation. It's discovering the impact of your identity in Him. It's knowing that you can be strong without ceasing to be sensitive, that you can lead without losing your gentleness, that you can teach, care, build, serve, without fading away. And that's exactly what I do today. I preach, not because I seek a platform, but because the word that healed me can no longer be silenced within me. I share what I've learned, even with a trembling voice, even with tears sometimes streaming down my face. And every time I tell my story, I feel as if I'm restoring a shred of dignity to another woman who still lives in silence. This moves me. It makes me rise every day with purpose, because if what once hurt me now serves to heal someone, then the pain was not in vain. And God has this power to transform scars into bridges, to take the darkest corners of our lives and use them as a stage for revelation. Today, I help other women who seek me out with the same pain in their eyes that I once carried. They come to me ashamed, with questions stuck in their throats, afraid they're sinning by wanting to start over. And I don't give formulas. I offer listening, acceptance, presence, because I know firsthand the value of being heard without being judged, of finding someone who not only understands the pain, but has been through it and survived it. And this creates something powerful, real connection, a network of healing that spreads silently, without a stage, but with truth. And above all, I live, something I used to only pretend to. I breathed, I moved, I fulfilled my obligations, but I didn't live. Today, I live with ease, even on difficult days. I live with greater awareness of what's good for me, of what I can accept, of what I need to let go. I live with faith, not as armor to hide my weaknesses, but as a safe place where I can be myself, whole, imperfect, but loved. And that is liberating. None of this happened overnight. It was a long journey, full of detours, restarts, painful behind-the-scenes moments, and difficult decisions. But I look back and see clearly, God wasted nothing. Not the suffering, not the falls, not the pauses. Each step led me to this version of myself that today, I can honestly say, represents me, because it was forged in truth. And truth, when embraced with courage, transforms everything. My faith didn't die. It was refined, tested in fire, emptied of formulas, purified of voices that only knew how to repeat commandments without compassion. Before, my faith was very much tied to what I did, serving, praying, pleasing, resisting. Today, it's about who God is, even when everything falls apart. It was in the desert of my story that I truly knew this God, not as a pulpit theory, but as a living presence behind the scenes of my pain. I knew the God who isn't frightened by our brokenness, who doesn't turn His face away from our shame, who isn't offended by our silences, our questions, or the days when we can only say, "Help me," with our eyes. It was on the ground, without strength, without spiritual credibility, without the status of a leader's wife, that I experienced the most powerful grace of my life. Not the grace we recite in memorized verses, but the one that finds us when we can no longer get up on our own. And that's where my faith blossomed, in the desert, in the improvisation, in the middle of nowhere, where everything seemed lost. God showed me that it is there, in that dusty landscape, where natural eyes see nothing promising, that He plants the seeds of something new. The faith that sustains me today doesn't depend on applause or structures. It is a root, and the deeper it goes, the stronger it grows. If God took me out of a marriage that was killing me inside, it was because He wanted to give me life, real life, the kind that no longer needs to hide behind appearances or ready-made phrases. Life with meaning, with lightness, with space to breathe and be whole. And if he did this for me, after everything I've been through, after everything I believed was lost, then I know he can do it for you too. No matter how hurt, confused, exhausted you are, no matter if everyone tells you to stay where you are, God knows the behind the scenes of your life. He sees what no one else sees, and he doesn't remain silent in the face of what destroys you. My story isn't about a happy ending. It's about a true new beginning. It's about a transformation of mindset, about decisions that tear but heal, about faith that grows in the desert. It's about having the courage to let go of what was comfortable to live what is real. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And today I look back and see every tear was a seed. Every no I had to say, every door I had to close, every renunciation, all of this was preparation. God didn't just free me from a situation. He called me to a new identity. And if you feel like you're also hearing this call, even if it's still whispered, it's because he's already started something within you. And this is never in vain.